welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones, and so glad you could all be here. We're continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 59. I'll share my screen and we can get started. All right. So we're working with the Pepper and Wong translation today. And it starts off by saying, whether governing people or serving heaven, and we'll kind of pause and talk about this just for a second. So the opening line then about governing people really sets the stage for the particular focus this chapter has. It's on that issue again of governing, or how does someone work within that perspective. And it also has that secondary statement, or serving heaven, which is kind of interesting because there's much more of a naturalistic approach within the Tao Te Ching and even within Zhuangzi for how they understand what Tian, or heaven, is. And it's much more really kind of like saying nature. So another way we could talk about serving nature and how it's been translated in other uh, translations is something like looking after nature. So there's kind of a interesting comparison that they're making here, saying whether you're talking about governing people or you're talking about how do you look after nature, there's something that's going to be similar between these two. And the solution it comes up with is be like a farmer who stores rice. So we've had a be like statement once before, and this was can't remember exactly the chapter now. I think it might have been chapter 8. I'll have to double check. But we had the be like water. So here we have be like a farmer. And the character that's used for this has the implication about the storing up of rice, but it can also be used in the sense of just saying a farmer as well. The rest of the passage is going to go on and talk a little bit about storing rice, but the key thing that they're really emphasizing here is something about how the farmer works, or how the farmer goes about doing his job. And so we want to think a little bit about how these things are related. So if we're thinking about governing people, or how we look after heaven or serving heaven or nature, that they're seeing a connection with how someone does the role of being a farmer, and maybe even specifically about this idea of storing rice. So what do you think, or what maybe comes to mind in terms of the relationship between this role and the role of governing and the role of farmer for you?
I don't know. I don't understand, I guess, why a farmer would store rice. So it's hard to say.
Oh, well, that's a good question then. So, anybody have some thoughts on why a farmer would store rice?
Maybe for the winter.
Yeah, exactly. So we tend to be fairly removed, a lot of us, from farming communities, but one of the things that they'll have often is like these big silos and whatnot, and they store their grain. All right, there's these big grain silos, and yeah, because the things only grow a certain time of the year, right? And there's a time of harvest, but people still need to eat all year long. And so if the type of thing you're growing in this case is something like rice, then there's a time where you go through the different cycles of preparing the fields for the rice, planting the rice, cultivating the rice, harvesting the rice, and then you have to actually hold on to the rice as well, not just eat it all at once, to carry you through the rest of those cycles where you're planting and cultivating and stuff. So yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Taylor.
About this. Have you ever read there's a Malcolm Gladwell book. Um, Maybe it was Outliers. Um, I I can't recall for sure, but it's one of his books about I think like the development of talent or mastery,
Mm,
and he talks about the cultural influence on individuals. And he talks about the difference between European agriculture and Asian agriculture, where specifically European agriculture was mostly based around wheat, which grows for a certain season. And while it's growing, you have to work hard to cultivate it, and then you have to harvest it, and then you have to store it for the winter. And then you pretty much do nothing for the other like 7 months out of the year. As opposed to rice farming, but in Asia, the main crop being rice, which I don't know how it works in different climate zones, but most rice farming is in paddies where uh, you basically, the more you work, the more you produce. So you can work like cultivating, growing rice every day, like throughout the year, and you'll get more rice.
Oh,
And uh, and he talks about how this sort of led to a difference in the European and Asian work ethic overall, where the European work ethic is you work hard for a while, then you rest. The Asian work ethic is more like you work hard every single day, um, because of the difference in the requirements of farming uh, wheat versus rice. So I'm thinking about this in the context of what you're saying, uh, about like working to produce the harvest and then store it for the winter. That is how it works with wheat, but I think rice farming actually works differently. Um, and so I'm really curious about why this would say be like a farmer who stores rice. And you mentioned, well, it says be like a farmer who stores rice or just a farmer. I wonder what
well, I
your
put in that or just a
translation
farmer.
actually says.
Yeah, I put in or just a farmer because there's notes that the character that is talking about that is also sometimes used to denote just a farmer. Um, so that I was just adding that in as a note. That part's not actually in the translation.
Yeah, well, the question it raises is just does this like uh is it the same meaning, and is the who stores rice part really significant? I think I have a feeling it's much will be revealed by whatever comes next. And
Sure. Well, and I will say too, Dane, that we've had a couple of other passages that talk about the problem of misgovernment in which the granaries are empty. So there's definitely a way that the grains, or in this case, the rice, is actually stored. In terms of their growing cycle, it's I believe the book you're referring to is maybe The Tipping Point, where he gets into that. Yeah, and I honestly don't remember the section talking about the difference in the work ethic between the wheat versus the rice, focus on how they were doing agriculture. But I'm sure there's still things that are impacted by seasons, and China's got a lot of different climates as well. The geography is varied, so it may be different in different locations. One of the books I started to get into that I have to keep going through, so I don't have a ton of information on it yet. But one of the things that was interesting is even within China, looking at the different geographical locations, there were some places where you had to work a lot harder to actually produce food, and other places that were much more fertile and it was much easier to grow food. And it was interesting to note the distinction of where Confucius arose, or Confucianism, and where Taoism, or where Lao Tzu was located, were very different climates. And in the Confucian zone, it was one where you had to work much harder at actually producing food. Whereas in the location where Lao Tzu was located, it was much more flush and easier to produce and benefit from that. And that may have led to some of the distinctions in the approaches that Confucius had versus Lao Tzu in terms of how much you can rely on nature or just let things kind of happen naturally versus having to be very structured and organized in how you do things. So yeah, that those geographical patterns that people pick up and the cultural context within those geographies is very interesting. There's a whole subsect in cultural anthropology that focuses on this idea of cultural continents, where you have kind of shared cultural ways of doing things based on the geography that is really extensive. Like there's a lot of things that go into shaping who a particular people are based on things related to their geography. So those are some great points to bring up, and I wish I knew more about how they do rice now. But in either case, we still have the idea of a farmer, and it clearly at some point there's thoughts that
It
is,
does seem like Asian people always work on holidays, you know, like Asian stores and things. They always do seem to work on holidays.
yeah, you know, it would be an interesting thing to look at that further. I'll have to go back to, I think I still have a couple of his books, Malcolm Gladwell, and I'll see if I can track that down. It's been a while since I looked at that book, so thanks for the reminder. Yeah, so okay, so we maybe don't have as the similar picture in terms of what the cycle looks like for how they do rice, but there was at least from other places in the book clearly ideas that things were stored, and here it's talking about storing rice. So there's an aspect of that that comes into play, even if the cycles are more frequent or more ongoing. Um, and again, when you're dealing with an agricultural community, and when it starts to grow into more of like a city or a nation state, so to speak, it's a little bit, out of place to talk about nation states at certain points in history, but the concept, we can think of it in those terms. You have to deal with people who are not farmers benefiting from the surplus. So you still have to somehow deal with the retainers and with the army and with the emperor and all the people that are involved in managing the hierarchy, who are not actually producing food, still need to also eat. So there's a way that you have to collect and maintain the surplus in order to deal with the demands of the community as a whole, which is going to come into play. So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about farming and storing rice, any thoughts come to mind about what the relationship to governing people and farmers might be?
Yeah, to me it's saying like, and this is just maybe a sprout of a thought, but haha, farming. Um, like cultivate your people, cultivate, you know, your community, but don't take it for granted. Like prepare for the future and um not be careful, but like just be ready in case something happens. I don't know.
Yeah.
Something along those lines.
Hmm. That's good. Anybody else have some thoughts?
Well, there's a fable about the ant and the grasshopper. It seems to be saying be like the ant.
Yes. Is everybody familiar with that fable?
I think so.
You want to tell what the fable is, Dane?
Mm, well, as best I recall, it was just like the ant stored food and the grasshopper didn't, and then when winter came, the grasshopper had to beg for food from the ant or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think I did hear. I think I have heard something like that before. Also, it's making me think of A Bug's Life. Like
I think it
really.
was one of Aesop's fables, maybe.
Yeah. So one of the other things that we've looked at in the past in terms of thinking about agricultural communities and the things that were important in agricultural communities. And one of the things that was developed very early on is the idea of calendars. And this was, when I think about this, it's just fascinating that they had to be very keen observers of how the patterns worked in their world to understand like the transition of where the stars were in the sky and numerous other things to notice and keep track of the changing seasons and how all these things happened through these regular patterns that then they could actually take advantage of when they're doing the different things that they had to do from an agricultural perspective. And it must have just been a tremendous effort to get there. Like if you had to start from scratch figuring out a calendar today, I don't even know where to begin. But it is actually something that is vital, especially when you're talking about an agricultural community, because it gives you the ability essentially to predict. You can say, okay, we know that in 10 days, we're going to start heading into the season or something like that, which is really powerful to be able to know, okay, we've got a month or two before something's going to happen. And that gives you a great deal of help when your main focus is on agriculture. And so there's been correlations that have been made at other points about how, let's say, you've got a smaller community that's doing agriculture, and there's probably some type of leader of that group, and they have to coordinate activities with all the people that are doing the various things. And they have to use the calendar in order to coordinate those types of activities. Well, one of the things that's really important is that they are being true to the calendar. It would be very inappropriate for that person to think, I know the calendar says that we've got 3 months before this is going to happen, but I think it might happen now. So we need to actually do things different. We need to start working on this stuff right away instead of waiting for this particular time frame. And that would be quite disastrous. It would be at a very serious level too, because you're talking about the production of your food supply. So if you get that wrong, then there's a lot of things at stake. People are going to suffer. And we saw the correlations previously when it says when Tao is forgotten and the government goes off tracks, yep, all the rich people still have their fancy clothes and all that kind of stuff, and they're all eating well. But for the general people, the fields are in disarray and the granaries are empty, right? And that's causing a lot of suffering. So the idea of the leadership is really focusing more on being true to these prior discovered patterns about how things happen. And so the role then for the leader within this Taoist concept is saying they need to be without desire in the sense of their own personal desires. They're not there to try and get their own gain. They're not there to come up with their own ideas. It's not about how unique that specific individual can be. It's more about how they can empty themselves of their own personal biases or agenda and actually help to orchestrate what needs to happen for the community in more of a selfless way for the benefit of the community, recognizing that that role of emperor exists for the sake of the empire, not for the emperor. And so this farmer motif, I think there's a lot of things there. Some of the things that were brought up about cultivating people, that can be something that could be looked at. The idea of being prudent with this idea of storage, but also this idea of really being in tune with those patterns of nature for understanding when you're supposed to do things at the right time. And maybe this is a little bit more where that serving heaven or looking after nature comes into play, is in that very idea. There's also, this is maybe a little bit off topic, but related. But if we think about one of the core concepts within the Tao Te Ching, that everything is essentially one thing, just manifest in different ways, then what we have is a tremendous interdependence and interconnectedness between everything. And so the benefit or health of the individual is really dependent on and recognized as dependent on the health of the whole. And this would include, what's happening in terms of like nature, in the sense of how they're growing their food and so forth. If the land is not healthy, then the people can't be healthy, and vice versa. Well, I shouldn't say vice versa. There's a lot that the land will do by itself, but there's a link between the two that has to be in place if things are going to be in balance and harmony for people to be able to have the type of food that they need. And yeah, so I think those are all some key factors they're thinking about when they're considering this idea of governing or leadership. It has to be someone who's there for the people, not for themselves. And their role is not to get creative in that sense, of going outside of the patterns, but to be able to clearly see what the patterns are and follow the patterns so that things can be successful. Very interesting, where we tend to look at who's like a very charismatic leader, or who has the most innovative ideas, and who can come up with all these, looking almost to that person like a savior, in the sense of what kind of skills do they have that we all need, that they can come into play and take care of things. Whereas in the Daodejing, the ideal ruler is somebody who's not special. They're just like everybody else, but they happen to be in a particular position. And the benefit of that position is to help organize the overall work of the community, but not to be stepping out of the bounds, to know what those patterns are, to understand how nature works in order to be successful. Any thoughts on that?
That idea, Jim, is very similar to what Daniel Quinn talks about in that book, The End of Civilization, that I mentioned. One of the key ideas from there is that just like all animals have their natural sort of social structure, like fish have schools and birds have flocks, and uh, antelope have herds and lions have prides and whatnot. Humans have a natural form of social organization, which is the tribe, where which is basically a group where everybody has a role in sustaining the health of the tribe. Everybody has a job to do, and including the job of the leader or the boss. It's just another job that somebody has to do. It's not like a special position in that sense. It's just another job that somebody has to do. No different or more special really than any of the other jobs. And he gives an example of a modern day tribe that still exists as a circus, basically the way like a circus where everybody travels around and shares a common livelihood and they all work together, is an example of a sort of a natural human tribe.
Interesting. Yeah, I read his other three books that were part of that Ishmael trilogy, but I haven't read that one. I'll have to check that out. Sounds like a very interesting book. Yeah, well, let's see where this goes then. So storing your rice is called preparing early. So we're getting to Taylor's thought about, being prepared or thinking about the future, and also Dean's idea about the ant, right? Storing things up. And it's going to say preparing early is called accumulating da. And da is, of course, the da from the Daodejing. And as we've seen, da is really focusing on the idea of how do we manifest Tao. So Tao is going to be these patterns that we can see and observe in reality in various realms, and the goal is how do we come into harmony with those things. And in the rest of nature, we see things just doing it naturally, right? Nobody's telling the tree what to do or telling the animals how to do what they're supposed to do. Everything just seems to kind of follow the pattern, and things are in balance. They just do what they do. Humans are the unique character in this, in that we can get ideas and start to think about trying to do things contrary. Not that we can actually do anything unnatural, but we can, in our efforts to try and do things differently, we can cause a lot of suffering and trauma, or just simply being unsuccessful in our endeavors. And so for the Taoists, there's a lot of focus on when we strip away all these cultural and personal constructs that are outside of or different from what those patterns are, then we will be more natural and spontaneous in the way that everything else in the world is. And the more that we exhibit that, then the more that we represent or show Da. So they're making a correlation here that storing the rice, preparing early, is a practice that is demonstrating that someone is following those patterns and is in alignment with those patterns. And so there's a way that we can talk about either accumulating or maybe cultivating might be a better way to think about this idea of Da within the person. But we want to keep in mind that what's the context of this, yes, we're talking about the farmer, but we're talking about the farmer as an analog for what the ruler should be of the people. And so this is, talking kind of on both sides of it, the individual as the farmer, but also how this is relevant for this idea of leadership. And then it continues and says, accumulate Da, and everything can be overcome. So here, I think, we see sometimes there's a little bit of hyperbole that gets used in the text. They take a bit of poetic license. So it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can't be overcome. There's obviously some things that are going to come up that are going to be very problematic, and you might not be able to find a solution for it. There could be a tsunami or an earthquake or a forest fire or something like that. But even in the midst of those different types of disasters, there's ways that if we're paying attention and working in harmony with the way things are, we're going to be better suited at trying to find appropriate ways to overcome the obstacles that have come before us. So that is going to be a byproduct of having a life spent on cultivating or accumulating, and the way they're talking about here, this idea of Da, that is directly or they're making a correlation between what a farmer has to do in order to be successful at what the farmer does, is the same type of thing that's going to help us or the leader in terms of developing that kind of way of being, demonstrating that Da that is going to be helpful when we come across challenging situations. Any thoughts on this section?
Well, I was just thinking about this experience that I've had. What makes me think of it is this idea that everything, well, there really is no such thing as going against the way of nature, because everything is ultimately in alignment with the way of nature. And there's this experience that I've had that I wonder if anybody else has had this similar kind of experience of where if you like go outside early in the morning and uh, you hear the birds calling, and maybe you see a few flying across the sky, and you look at a pond and you can see like the bugs skittering across the surface, and the fish darting about below, and everything has this quality of like naturalness to it and just so-ness, and it just kind of self-arising, and you kind of have this feeling that the whole universe is kind of there doing its thing, whether you're there or not, and you're just kind of observing the workings of nature. And do you know like that particular feeling I'm talking about when you like observe certain things? You just kind of feel like you're just observing nature in action, and it's sort of this observer kind of consciousness, I guess. But then I'll also have that same sensation sometimes, like in the middle of the city where there's cars
Hmm.
going back and forth down the street, and there's like a homeless person digging cans out of the trash, and I'll look at them and I'll think, like, even though they're a human being with all kinds of neuroses and addictions and everything else, if you just observe them, they're just like another piece of nature going about their business, just like the bugs flitting from flower to flower. Or if you just it's what's interesting to me is it's the same like quality of just kind of, if you just go into observer mode, then you can kind of see everything is sort of nature acting out its own nature in a way.
Yeah.
But whatever the setting is, whether it's urban or rural, or whether it's in the forest or wherever, you can just kind of see nature going about its business.
Yeah. Have you seen a movie? Boy, it's probably been a while now. I don't know. Might even be about 20 years ago at this point. It's called Baraka. There's no words to it. It's just a fascinating film where they go to all different places around the world and just film how different peoples live. And they do very interesting juxtapositions between very, let's say, indigenous types of societies and all the way across to modern urban scenarios. And it's just a fascinating experience. No words, just this haunting music and seeing all these images. Sometimes it's nature scene, sometimes it's people, and sometimes it's the different ways they're organized. And yeah, it really kind of gives that same sense. I sometimes, when I'm like driving down the freeway, think of, this is like an artery in a body, and the cars are all cells, and they're transporting, energy from one place to the other. And it is kind of interesting to see the correlation between all the busyness that we do is also another aspect of that natural phenomena and how it unfolds. Um, so yeah, I definitely hear you on that one.
I think the interesting thing about it is it's a matter of your internal state, whether you are seeing sort of the Tao at work in whatever you're observing, or whether you're wrapped up in your own anxieties and insecurities and thinking about your own ego or problems or whatever. It's really, the difference is inside you. It's
Mm,
not out there.
yeah. Yeah. And at the same time, I think there's also um, things where in that observation, even though they're by definition natural and that they're, if they can be done, then it must be, something that's considered natural in that sense. We can still see different implications, right? So if there's kind of some natural boundaries within species, like in our neighborhood, we'll sometimes have more rabbits, and then when we have more rabbits, then the coyotes show up more, and then when the coyotes are there, the rabbits go down, but then the coyotes disappear, and then eventually the rabbits come back, and there's kind of these natural checks and balances between these populations that will expand and contract based on the connection between everything else. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of checks on human activity, and there's like an imbalance that we can see because we've been so successful in our real superpower, which is the ability to cooperate, that it is still something that, even though it's natural, we can see its nature in an unbalanced state that will eventually have a correction. But the question is that going to be something that anything's going to survive? So hopefully we can figure out, even within our naturalness, more of that balance with the patterns that are, so that we can avoid those kind of devastating problems. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of good history with humans in that regard. Yeah, fascinating stuff to watch and see and be that observer, like you're saying. All right. So, following the track, then, the farmer is valuable because they are adhering to these patterns and they know how to follow them and they practice that preparation. And in doing so, it says that they're actually cultivating or accumulating this idea of Da, that they are in sync with those patterns and they're representing that natural state. And that if they have accumulated that and this has become part of who they are, then everything can be overcome. Or maybe in less hyperbolic terms, they're going to be better suited to be able to handle whatever comes, right? It's not that you can actually always fix everything or overcome everything, but we're in a better position now in order to be able to address those things because we've got this, maybe this lifetime of learning to live this way. And again, we're thinking in terms of the ideal ruler, that if they've come through a similar process, this is going to put them in an interesting place, because in the role of governing, they're going to have to be able to deal with unique situations that come up. And as those come up, whether it's, invading army or resource challenges or unexpected events like earthquakes or whatnot, then they're going to be better suited to know how to handle those situations if they've got this lifetime of cultivating that Da in terms of participating in those patterns. So then it says, when everything can be overcome, there are no limits. Now, this is translated a couple of different ways. One is the idea that there's no limits, or the idea that there's like nothing you cannot do. But others say that the limits are unknown, that we don't know how far it can go, or we don't know what's possible, right? There's more of this idea of possibility. And I think that's a key thing, that the idea here is that we're expanding our horizon in terms of what we think is possible. But we're doing it from that farmer's perspective, in the sense of working within the patterns that we see and how things naturally occur, that within that, if we've fully cultivated in that in ourselves, then the possibilities open up, and there's a lot of different ways. Like if we're having to deal with something to overcome, then the solutions are really going to depend on our being open to seeing things. If we go into fear mode or attack mode, then our scale of vision becomes much more truncated. Our possibility thinking is diminished. So there's more of an openness here that I think is talking about the possibilities that can expand. And from there it says, when there are no limits, you can have the nation. And again, this is translated a couple of different ways, but it's the general gist I get from a lot of the translations is essentially, now you're in a position to be effective in terms of being a ruler for the nation. So if you've gotten to this point where you've accumulated that you've taken on the role of how that farmer works and understood those patterns, and you've learned how to overcome obstacles, and you've learned how to have those possibilities before you, now you're capable, or in a position where you could be in a position of rulership. Any thoughts on that?
It's interesting how it's worded, you can have the nation, because that makes it feel like it's just in seeking power. Even though it's, I guess, even though it's not meant like that, that wording is kind of throwing me off a little bit.
Yeah, I wish I could have conversations with the different translators and find out what they were thinking with the different ways they phrase things.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's maybe not, because you're right. It sounds like they're like, okay, now you can take the nation, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that doesn't seem to really fit well with what we've been seeing. But there's definitely the idea that there's a way of, I mean, if you think about the job description here, it's pretty interesting, right? We're talking about somebody who can empty themselves of their own personal desire and biases, that they've become attuned with how nature works. And again, we're thinking about a time and place when they're basically agricultural communities, so that's going to be a really key factor. and they're talking about, being able to know how to apply these things to the challenges that happen, and be able to think about possibilities. Very different job description for leadership than than we normally see, right? Um, but the end result isn't so much about you can have in the sense of you can take it, in the sense of now you're the kind of person who can be entrusted with the nation. I think is maybe how it might be a little bit better. Like you could be entrusted with this at this point. And it has a little more here. It says, when you have the mother, um, sometimes we'll talk about mother as source in some of the translations of the nation, you can last a long time. And mother has been used a couple of different times in the Daodejing as another way of talking about Tao. So, and again, we've got that have, that possessive type thing. And I think it's more along the lines of, when you're in sync, or when which is another way that it talks about mother in the past. When you know the mother, you know the children type of an idea. So when you are in sync with the mother, they're identifying this or seeing this as kind of the source behind the nation, right? That the nation is a product, again, of this natural aspects, that the ruler finds themselves in the position not because they have specific, like, unique qualities that only they can bring to it, but in a sense because they've let go of their own personal things and gone with more what's needed for the whole. Then there's this idea of it persisting, right? So again, this brings us back to thinking about the nation when we're thinking about, well, what's persisting, or what's going a long time. Certainly there's an aspect we can talk about the benefits for human health in terms of living a balanced life. But I think here the idea of last long time is in the context of the nation. And so we've got this, multi-generational idea that there's an enduring quality that can happen when you're in sync with that foundation, right? This idea of the mother, that goes back to all these things leading up to it. The Da is a manifestation of Tao, and here Tao is probably being referred to as mother. Some other, well, at least one other commentator was suggesting that mother was actually in reference to the earth. And if you are thinking about the agricultural context of this, that could be something that ties in. But most of the other references when mother's being used in the Tao Te Ching seem to be in reference to the Tao itself. Then we have the conclusion. This is called having deep roots and firm ground. So again, very agriculturally oriented. The Tao of long life and lasting vision. And again, there's probably two different levels of this, certainly at a personal, but in this particular context, referring to the life of the nation. So that's this week's chapter. Now, we've got a few minutes left, and we can see if there's any thoughts or ideas people like to talk about in that regard.
Just curious, Jim, if you've read the Daodejing.
Actually, I have, not in its entirety, but I do reference it when I'm going through the different chapters. Taylor brought that to my attention maybe about a month ago, and it's it's definitely kind of humorous. There's
It's
two
very
versions
funny.
of it. One of them is just a kind of a translation, but then they did like an expanded edition that actually gets into a commentary, and the commentary is often quite good. Yeah. I was a fan of the Big Lebowski before, and I didn't really make that connection about him kind of personifying that idea of the wanderer, from more like the Zhuangzi Taoist type thing. But you think about the movie in that context, and it's like, oh yeah, there's a really nice connection between those two.
I need to watch it again. It's been a while.
Yeah. Any other thoughts about the chapter?
It's interesting how many chapters are about like leading
Hmm.
and governing people. Yeah, I feel like a lot, especially of the recent chapters, have been
Yeah.
about that.
And that's where they see somewhat of a division in the text between the first half, where it's focusing more on what they would say the Tao section, and the second half, which is focusing more on the Da section. But it really helps us to remember, this is coming out of that Warring States period, and that was like the prime question. And it also is really interesting because there's a debate that goes on about whether or not Daodejing is meant to be understood as a religion or as a philosophy. And I think we can see there's a lot of merit for why people would argue that this tends to be more of a philosophical text rather than a religious text. But of course, that's hotly debated. I think it's interesting what would happen if we were to apply more of these criteria for leadership to our modern context, whether we're talking about government or business or religious institutions or any type of grouping. It would be much different world if we had leaders that were actually focused on the benefit of the community versus their personal benefit.
Yeah, it's the motivations are completely different, I feel.
Yeah.
But it's funny because we always talk about having the same problems still that they're talking about here, even though the motivations are different.
Yeah. Which is a very interesting question. They're providing a lot of insight and a lot of good ideas. But if we're still wrestling with those same issues, is that because we just haven't tried it the right way? Or is it because it's just not part of human nature? Or is it something that just goes too against the grain? I don't know. I'm not willing to give up hope on that right now, but it is an interesting historical observation. In our in-person class, I've got a guy that's there, and he's always bringing it back to, where do we actually see this ever being lived out? And that's a good question.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine. Like, of course, you can imagine it. Like, oh, it all sounds like, governance nirvana. But also, can we do it? Because it's been this long and seems like we're not there still.
Yeah. I wonder if some of it's a scale issue that there's a lot of looking to more indigenous cultures or hunter-gatherer type groups, tribes, and how they seem to implement more of these ideas and have ways of keeping checks on the different actors in the community and checks on strong men rising to power. But maybe it's, I don't know if I'd say easier, but maybe it's more practical to do that in smaller groupings. Maybe part of our challenge is the scale that we've gone to.
Yeah. I think
Jim, do you know
we
Chris Ryan?
It's not ringing a bell by the name, but what's the context?
Well, Christopher Ryan he wrote a book called Sex at Dawn about the evolution of human sexuality.
Hmm.
Um, I guess he's basically an anthropologist. He also has a podcast that I used to listen to a long time ago. But I remember one of the things he talked about was how basically when people get along fine as long as there's not a surplus. So like in hunter-gatherer cultures where everybody relies on everybody else for their survival, and everybody, like the whole tribe has to share everything, resources and everything, then people are really good at cooperating. But he talks about in situations where there was some kind of natural surplus, like in the Pacific Northwest, where the salmon runs made it really easy for to accumulate lots of food, and you didn't have to work hard, and there was like sort of a natural surplus. Then dominance hierarchies would arise, and people would fight over the surplus and stuff. So he kind of makes the point that as long as there's scarcity and humans have to rely on each other for survival, they get along great.
Hmm.
But as soon as things get easy and there's a surplus to fight over, people will fight over it.
That's a very interesting observation. That sounds like so is that covered fairly extensively in that book, or is it really focused on other things?
I don't actually, I don't remember how much he talks about that in his book versus maybe I just heard him talk about it on his podcast. But it's an idea that I know, like I've heard him reference in multiple contexts, that basically as soon as there's a surplus, we start fighting over it.
Hmm. Interesting.
We
Yeah.
talked about something similar before, like when we're talking about tribes and hunter-gatherer type situations. The risk for not working together is much higher than it
Oh, yeah.
is for us to not work well together, because we can afford that, and we can just go find it somewhere else, whereas if you're in a hunter-gatherer tribe, if you do that, you're likely going to be on your own and going to die or
Right.
something.
Yeah, we still have the interdependence on everybody else, but we've been able to abstract it a bit and create more anonymous interactions in modern society that give the
Yeah.
illusion of independence, but we're still all very much interdependent. We just have the illusion of that autonomy. But that,
Daniel Schwarzenberger talks about the difference between, well, with sub Dunbar level groups where everybody can sit in a tribal council and hear each other, and everybody can be heard and understood and have a voice, and everybody knows each other, versus in a larger group where most people are strangers and we interact differently with strangers versus people we know, in terms of like sharing resources, where you share your resources with somebody you know. Yeah, sure. Where you share your resources with a stranger,
yeah, yeah,
it gets a lot more iffy.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about that a lot lately, that maybe part of our challenge right now is the scalability, that maybe what we need to think about is more in terms of replication of, communities that are more self-sufficient, and how they can work with each other, but trying to like grow it to one big group instead of a bunch of smaller groups might be where we're getting ourselves into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I think there still are risks for us to not work together. They're just not as immediate or as apparent as they would be in a hunter-gatherer tribe. Like, we're seeing people all on social media and kind of isolating, and people are getting really lonely. And like, as far as fighting over the surplus, they pretty much fight over anything these days, not just a surplus of resources. And it's really creating a division instead of a fostering of connection. So
Yeah.
I think there still are risks that we're seeing. It's just not as apparent, which makes it easier. Not easier, but it fosters an environment of conflict, I think.
Yeah, makes it more dangerous because you don't see the immediate consequences.
Yeah.
It does go back to Daniel Quinn's idea of humans naturally organizing into tribes, and kind of we need to be organized into tribes, kind of like you were saying, Jim. Human beings need to be part of a tribe, which is a group of people who share a common livelihood. They all work together to support the livelihood of the tribe, and everybody knows and sort of looks after each other in that group. Um, and uh, and that doesn't scale beyond a certain number. Once it gets larger than a certain number, So there actually, I've heard Daniel in one of his recent interviews talked about how there are different thresholds, where sort of different dynamics emerge. And so if you've got a small enough group, then everybody in that group can look after each other, sort of like an extended family. But once you get beyond a certain size, then it no longer is possible for everybody in that group to know and care about everyone else.
Yeah. And I know we're at time, but I'll just kind of throw an idea out there. And if some folks have to drop, I understand.
And I got time.
But the other piece of that that I find really interesting is when you talk about the tribes, like if in more of a modern context, um, we could say that we maybe self-identify by certain values or certain work ethic or a certain, thing of production, right? And maybe we've got a bunch of these different kinds of tribes that are around. That works really well when people are self-selecting, when they're like, I think about like the diversity of different religious options, right? Somebody can say, I identify a little bit more with this, and that feels like my tribe. I want to go be a part of that group. And even though they have their own way of doing things that's maybe not like how everybody else does it, I'm happy to be there because it resonates with me. But what's interesting is what happens then for the next generation is, you know, then when you're talking about a situation of somebody being born into it, that's the part that gets kind of weird, because then what happens with that new life? Is it really, and it's not wrong, I think, for parents to try and instill their values and ways of looking at the world on their children, or to help their children to be able to have those perspectives, but it's not always a good fit. And so, hunter-gatherer tribe, it's like, well, sorry, you have to be with us because there's no way to not be with us. Although there was, intermarrying and people could, potentially hook up with different groups. Um, but in the modern context, if we were to um, have more self-sustaining communities that were more self-selected around common ideas and values that worked well for that group, how do we handle that next generation, or how does that next generation have the flexibility of moving between the different groups? I think is where it gets interesting for me, like the challenge.
There are some religions that don't proselytize to their kids, but they don't grow very large.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting with the Amish, how they have this opportunity when the kids become late teenagers to go out and explore the world and make a decision for themselves if they want to come back and be part of the community or leave. And I think that's a very good process for trying to, you know, account for that particular dilemma. Um, I don't know how effective it is, because if you're so ingrained in one particular way of life and you go outside of it, you're going to be very ill prepared for what that other life looks like. And it might not be something that feels like an option, but I don't know what the solution out of it is. It's other than, even if we have self-selected smaller groupings, that there just needs to be more of an ability to have dialogue across groups and not see it as we've got to get everybody to be one thing, but that the diversity is respected and appreciated, because it adds that uniqueness to things, that we can continue in that friendly dialogue and potentially have people be able to migrate to different types of communities that fit better with who their particular personality is.
I think that tradition makes a lot of sense in the context of the Amish community, and kind of like the way there are a lot of people who like drop out of Mormonism as adults and become extremely anti-Mormon, sort of uh, heads that sort of thing off the past. But what I'm talking about is like religions that don't proselytize their kids at all. Like my grandmother was a member of some like really small obscure cult. I don't know the name of it. They had meetings they didn't call it church, they called it meeting on Sunday. And nobody else in her family, she was like really, really devout, but also almost like secretive. Nobody else in her family knew. I think she gave her kids the opportunity to go. She's like, you can come if you want. If not, even her husband, like, wasn't, wasn't a member of it. It was because it was so extremely personal and private that like you never talk about it. She didn't have Bibles or crosses on display in her home. You wouldn't know that she was a member of it,
Mm.
unless you were really, really close to her. So I think that, and because I think that's part of the doctrine of the religion is that you don't. It's like Fight Club. You don't talk about it. If somebody, if somebody's interested, you can invite them. They can come. They can see what it's like. But you don't proselytize even to your own kids and family.
Yeah. Interesting.
And of course, those religions don't get as big as Mormonism and Catholicism and those kind of things.
They're
Sure.
not doing that.
Well,
That's
and
why they don't grow.
the two that you listed, Mormonism and Catholicism, both have interesting birth practices too, where they try to actually have more kids. Um, so they have kind of an internal growth mechanism. Well, all right. We'll bring that to a close for today. I'm glad you were able to join us. And if you're watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussion on Friday mornings, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll receive an email with the latest videos as well as links to the live discussion. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, where you can meet with us in person. All right, guys, take care.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.